welcome back to Everlong Rising, everybody. The next speaker is me, so thank you for coming along. So this is basically the research that I've been doing over the last year or so. A lot of it's theory, some of it's practice, and it's basically just been looking into what our present day scientific research is saying, and then looking back into what some of the other people have been saying, probably mostly post pre-1900. People like Faraday, what Maxwell was actually saying, Heaviside, Tesla especially. So this is basically giving you an outline of some of the stuff that I've been looking at. In the alternative technology, you've got people like Keeley. Has anybody heard of these people? Tesla, Schauberger, Walter Russell, John Bedini, for instance, and Ed Gray I've especially been interested in, just because of some of the articles that I've read back in the 60s and 70s by Tom Valentine outlining Ed Gray's work, and the headlines were quite amazing because they were basically saying that they were going to save the American taxpayer £6 billion and they never had to use petrol again. Just interested in where some of this technology's gone and why it's not out there as well. Also looking at orgone, what orgone actually is, how it works, and obviously if you look at the bottom, orgone accumulators, and looking into the dolmens and stuff like that, and looking at how they work and the way they're built as well. And also into how consciousness fits into all this with the ether, prana, chi, telluric energy, and life force energy, because I came to the conclusion that they're all pretty much the same thing, just different names and different cultures. This talk is not going to go in depth into all of them. I will be going quite in depth into the Tesla stuff, but it's just basically a brief outline. There's just not enough time within 90 minutes to go too far into it all. So I started looking at energy and what we call energy and how we measure it. Now we're kind of taught that energy is the kind of background force within the universe, but it's interesting to look at what we actually observe, because all our senses and the instruments we measure are only picking up radiation, which is only a very small part of what is actually out there. Now in modern quantum mechanics they're adding all sorts of things into the equations in order to counteract this, because they know that there's more energy in the universe than they can account for, essentially. So we end up with dark flow and dark matter and stuff like this. But I've been looking a little bit into what lies under all that, and other possible explanations that go in the face of relativity, basically. So energy is basically an indirectly observed quantity, which means that we see the effect rather than the cause. We see a secondary process. Everything that we observe is basically reflected, refracted, all those other qualities. So what is it that we actually measure? What we measure is, as I've already said, all radiative materials. If we can't observe it with our senses, then we basically build an instrument that is able to observe it. If we can't, or we haven't thought of the instrument, then we can't detect it, we don't know it's there. Okay? And potential energy is the energy stored in the system. Okay? How do you detect the potential energy of the universe? Very difficult to isolate one point when everything's in constant flux. So I've kind of been looking into how the universe works and this whole fractal makeup that it's got. I've looked into a lot of work where it's basically looking at how systems are set up in what we call octaves, and you kind of zoom into them and zoom out, and they all appear to be very similar when you're moving up and down these octaves. So I think there's a link there basically between planetary systems moving down into what we call everyday sort of molecules, and then moving into atoms, electrons, and going down into that, but also zooming back out again. I think everyone can pretty much agree on that. and also started looking at waveforms. Now, it's known that in solids and liquids there are three types of waveform. Now, you've got a transverse wave, which is, we can do a little exercise here actually, if people want to just join arms and do that. Anybody? That is essentially your transverse wave, okay? So that's how the movement works, and it's always, you get your amplitude in the opposite direction in which it's moving. Now if you join arms again and push against each other, that is your longitudinal wave. Now the longitudinal wave acts much more quickly than the transverse, okay? The transverse takes quite a lot of time to travel from one end to the other, whereas a longitudinal is more or less instant, okay? Now we know that in solids and liquids, these three types of wave, the Rayleigh wave is actually a combination of the two. And what happens, these are quite difficult to see, and this is actually pulled off the internet. In here you've got a little blue particle, okay, which you're probably really struggling to see. Now in these, the particle's actually moving, and what's happening is that as this wave, this is your transverse wave, you see the rarefication where the particles are slightly nearer and then further apart, nearer than further apart. And what happens is the particle starts to rotate, and the rotation is always backwards compared to the way the wave is moving. Okay, so that's where your Rayleigh wave comes from, which is always a circular motion. You find it especially in water, in the sea, especially when the waves are coming in, there's always a circular motion which is working backwards compared to the wave. We know these waves have to be with one another in solids and liquids, but we're taught that in the electromagnetic spectrum you only see the transverse wave. So in electromagnetics we're taught that the longitudinal wave especially is not present, okay? As we'll see later on in the talk, there is a lot of evidence that the longitudinal wave is actually quite important and is alive and well, basically, in the electromagnetic spectrum. So I was doing a lot of research, especially into the stuff that Peter Lindeman's been doing and John Bedini, and I found this book, basically, which was highly recommended by Peter Lindeman. A book by Jerry Vasilitos, and I recommend that anybody who's sort of interested in alternative technologies reads this. It's not just based around Tesla, but the first sort of 80 pages or so is all Jerry Vasilitos' theorem on what Tesla was actually up to. Now, most of us think of Tesla, is everyone aware of Tesla? Yeah? And most of the time we're sort of aware of what he did with AC. Okay, the fact that he had this circular motion, magnetic current basically going around, and he basically harnessed the Niagara Falls, made AC applicable to distributive services within the electrical industry. What we're not aware of is the other stuff he was doing. He basically finished more or less with his AC projects in 1890. And from then onwards, what Jerry Vasilitos is basically saying, after looking through all the information, is that he started working with something else entirely, which was all to do with pulsed DC. He actually came across this by looking at the work of Hertz. Now, Hertz was looking for the transverse wave after Maxwell's come out with the theorem basically saying the longitudinal wave wouldn't exist and electromagnetics would only travel in transverse waves. So Hertz did this little experiment basically. He had a large capacitance device, he had a ring of steel, and he was basically making huge pulses which were supposed to be travelling across the room, and then he had this little device that he put over his head, and he had a tiny little spark gap in it, and he said that he could walk across the room and basically find a little tiny spark gap where the longitudinal wave, the transverse wave was travelling through the air. So Tesla basically tried to replicate what Hertz had done, and essentially he completely disagreed with Hertz's theorem and said that he hadn't found what he had because he wasn't accounting for the resistance within the air for the transverse wave movement. So there's no way he could have found the results. And he actually presented this to Hertz. And Hertz, before this theorem was basically taken up, according to Vasilitos anyway, was going to withdraw his theory. So I don't know if anybody knows, but the majority of modern electrics is basically based on Hertz's work. And you know, it seems that for the last 100 years or so we've probably been led down the wrong path with all this stuff, because he wasn't detecting what we actually think he was detecting. But the interesting thing that Tesla did find was that these pulses that were coming through this device, this large capacitance device, were creating a shock wave across the room which could be detected. It was an effect that had been found in the electrical industry. They were actually using these massive DC generators, and when they were throwing the switch they were getting this effect which was firing out of the wires because they just could not take up the charge quickly enough. They wouldn't carry it, and basically you used to get these white flames that shot out and pretty much killed anybody that was in the vicinity, which is why we have heavily isolated switches these days, because we don't want that effect again, essentially. So Tesla was very interested in the effect, and he started making apparatus in order to be able to use this effect and experiment with it, basically. And he wanted to remove the oscillations from the effect. He discovered that he could get this supercharging effect fired across the room, and the more he took out the oscillations, which are not like AC, these are more like a longitudinal push, but he didn't want any backwash from it at all. He wanted it just to go one direction, so it's a completely unidirectional charge. When he was doing this, he was getting these amazing piercing, stinging sensations on his face. So he started making different apparatus so he could automatically set up and be completely on the other side of his experimental apparatus in his lab. But what he found was it was stinging him from huge distances away. I mean, he had a 5-story building in New York, and essentially wherever he stood in the building he was getting these shock waves coming flying across the room. So what he did, he started putting up barriers. And he knew from Faraday's work that copper and glass essentially would create a barrier against any transverse wave, so they basically push the wave around them rather than it coming straight through. But this effect that he'd found was basically coming straight through the copper and straight through the glass. So it was a different effect. It wasn't a transverse wave. It wasn't the same as the stuff that Faraday was working with. Okay. Right. Okay, so these are some of the apparatus basically that Tesla started building. This one on the left here is a counter-rotating spark gap. So this is one part of it here, and it's basically a wheel spinning with contacts on it, and this part here is spinning in the opposite direction. So he was really interested in controlling the timing on the pulses. The faster he got it, the different effects he was getting from it, as we'll discover in a minute. And these are some of the spark gaps he was using. This one here is basically a magnetic one, and he's using the magnets in order to blow out the spark so he can control the durations again. This one is really counterintuitive, because if anyone knows anything about plasma, it gets extremely hot. But he's actually blowing hot air across this one. So that, to me, doesn't make any sense, but Tesla obviously knew something that we don't. So he found that changing the rate of blowout made different effects. Basically, he could make luminescence, he could essentially change the feeling in the room, he could make it hot, he could make it cold. But what he found was that he had to get it down to 0.1 of a millisecond before it stopped causing the stinging sensation and the pain. Okay, so all the stuff he was doing, I mean, that's incredibly quick. 0.1 of a millisecond, a millisecond is obviously a thousandth of a second, so that's a 10,000th of a second he was getting these durations down to with physical apparatus. These days we've got transistors that can do millions of times a second, but it's quite a feat of engineering to get two spinning devices spinning at 10,000 RPM, I can tell you that for a fact. Okay, so he actually found that the cooling breezes also came with an uplifting mood, which is where this all gets kind of interesting, because consciousness is being affected by an electromagnetic discharge, which leads you to kind of wonder what we're actually feeling and what interactions we're having and where they actually come from and what kind of spectrum they're working in. Okay, so where do emotions reside and how can an electromagnetic discharge affect an emotion? Okay, so, and he also found that none of these effects could be replicated with AC. He tried very hard, and basically none of this stuff could be done with AC. It had to be pulsed DC. Okay, so some of these, this is the basis of the apparatus that he was using in the end. The original apparatus he was using, which is the Hertzian apparatus, is this capacitor here. This is the generator, this is the spark gap, and he would just use this first ring around the outside. That was his original apparatus. Okay, but what he's got here is a secondary apparatus. What he found was that if he put a coil into the middle, he started calling this his special primary and this is special secondary, which is why most people think that he was basically using transformers, but they're not. This is nothing like transformers, because what he was using was not electricity as we understand it in a transformer. But this secondary would basically take the discharges from the primary, and rather than them passing through it, it would shoot them up the side. And what he found was that the voltages, or the potentials I should say, were massively increased by the time it got to the top of this. And then he had the device earthed, and he was using an aerial system. Okay, so he found that it was important what this was basically made of, because if you used a metal on this, it started releasing free electrons. So he found that whatever he was actually using, the kind of energy that he was using, when it interacted with the metal, it would start throwing out free electrons, which would start generating electricity. But the free electrons, essentially alpha particles, and can be incredibly dangerous. And yet one day in his laboratory, he actually got hit over the heart and almost died through this. So kind of quickly started experimenting with other materials like glass and carbon as well, in order to make it safer, ceramics. So he also found that he could change the shape of this. Sometimes he'd use a cylinder, sometimes he'd use a cone shape. Now when he made a cone shape, basically he made it very directional. When he used the cylinders, he could kind of spread the effect out. And what he found is if you put a metal plate on the other side of his laboratory and then directed the cone at it, he could basically pass the potential straight through the air, and it would hit the metal plate and cause an electric effect on the other side. This is where his basic experiments, which we'll come to in a minute, with Wardenclyffe are all coming from. He found that he could basically pass this straight across and create electric by passing it through the air rather than needing a wire. So he started broadcasting electricity effectively. So this is just a summary really of the stuff we've just been to. So he found that the electroradiant event is produced by a high voltage. It has to be direct current. It has to be discharged across the spark gap. And he wanted it interrupted abruptly before any reversal could occur. Okay. The effect is greatly increased when the source of direct current is charged by a capacitor. The electroradiant event leaves wires and other current components perpendicular to the flow. So if the transverse wave is going this way, it makes sense that the longitudinal is going the other way. The electroradiant event produces a spatially distributed voltage that can be thousands of times higher than the initial spark discharge voltage, which doesn't really make any sense. But what we're seeing here, it would seem, is something else interacting with the event that you've caused and coming into the process, because nothing can be isolated. Most of the experiments that we do these days, they try and tell you that they've isolated the experiment, it's done in the lab. However, we know from nature that everything is interacting with everything else. So what Tesla was finding is that if he did this correctly and he made this longitudinal wave shoot out, basically the universe would start acting upon a point and would start to try and rebalance the potential that he caused, the difference in potential that he caused. The universe would act upon it and try to bring it back into balance. And what he was finding is that when he was broadcasting the stuff, he actually did experiments at Colorado Springs in the end, where he was broadcasting at 23 miles into a mock-up of a house, and he was finding that by the time he got to the other end, he had more electricity than when he started. So it's actually completely the opposite of what we're used to, where we get massive voltage losses. Okay. So the electroradiant event.
Didn't he blow up kind of in Colorado? Didn't he blow up places? Like
he was blowing up equipment all the time. He had real problems.
He was blowing up straight electricity places by doing that.
He did have one instance, I think that was at Wardenclyffe though, where he blew up one of the generating stations that was supplied to him by George Westinghouse. But that was later on. Yeah. So the electroradiant event penetrates all materials. It creates electronic responses in metals, like copper and silver. Okay, so the electronic response basically means that there's an electrical charge that will build up within that material that this beam is hitting. The electroradiant event with impulses shorter than 100 microseconds are completely safe to handle and will not cause the pain that he was finding in the first instances when he was doing this. And the electroradiant impulses shorter than 100 nanoseconds are cold, and they cause lighting effects which are similar or the same as the light coming from the sun, which is interesting as well, because it leads you to start questioning what's actually going on at the sun and what is actually coming in and being beamed at us by the sun. Okay. So these are some of the other. This is just on the Tesla patents. This is the patent that he put in to kind of try and protect this device before he tried to get the backing to create it. As we know that he had a lot of problems with JP Morgan. Patent only lasts 17 years, and if the inventor can't get backing in that time, then basically it goes out to all and sundry. And anyone can come in and start pinching your ideas. And I have serious disagreements with the patent system, just because a lot of the stuff gets taken into the military industrial complex and never sees the light of day, seemingly. These are 6 systems basically.
Continually renew the original patents.
Yeah, it costs a lot of money though.
Still though, they just do it in it.
Yeah.
Just like,
well, a lot of it, once it's taken in as official secrets, they just don't release it for 60, 70, 80 years. A lot of Tesla's work is still under official secrets. And these are 6 systems basically that all will power these apparatus, all working off a DC dynamo. And he's got various systems where he has secondary dynamos, he has capacitance circuits, spark gaps in here. They're all ways of generating the same longitudinal unidirectional pulse. So this is a picture of Tesla in the Colorado Springs facility. Most people wouldn't sit anywhere near a normal electrical discharge like that. What Tesla's finding is that these are basically completely harmless. They won't electrocute you, as we'll see later on. There are actually photographs of people using this energy. I won't tell you too much now, but you don't get electrocuted by it. It's really interesting. And he's sitting within the effect. And it's interesting again with a lot of these devices that I'll be talking about, there seems to be a conscious effect that happens around the device, which uplifts and brings you into tune, allows you to have greater and better ideas whilst sitting in the presence of it. So there's a whole two-way process that's going on with these devices. which I find really interesting, because I think once we start making these, installing them into homes, what we're going to find is a complete reversal of what we find now, where the 50 Hertz systems aren't really very good for our bodies, and they're kind of bringing us down rather than bringing us up. There's a few more pictures here. Absolutely amazing discharges. They're not very angular, as you'll notice. When these have been studied, they've been found to contain Fibonacci sequences. So they're almost like the branches on a tree, the way they spread out, which is not like the normal angular arc that you get. And this is the Colorado Springs facility. I've managed to... Yeah, this is one of his Tesla coils, which is the primary here, and this is the special secondary, and this is the aerial on the top, basically. This is a huge Tesla coil, which is basically about 10 foot high, and you could do some real damage with that, I should imagine. But this here is, again, this whole station is a Tesla coil, essentially. This is the broadcast ball on the top. This is the one he was using to broadcast the electricity 23 miles. So he had the whole setup basically already done before he even went to the Wardenclyffe site. Colorado Springs was a working station essentially, but he wanted to make it bigger because he had this dream about putting it right around the planet rather than just in a probably an American wide with this system. This is one of the luminous globes. He's holding it in his hands, as you can see, and it's basically being electrified by the potential in the air. So we're not entirely sure. I've got a book all about these globes. We're not entirely sure what he was filling them with. He was doing lots of experiments with single wires, tungsten filaments, all sorts of different gases within them. But nitrogen and oxygen in the air just seem to work just as well as something like neon and argon, interestingly enough. And these are schematics for the Wardenclyffe Tower. As we can see, you've got your primary here at the bottom, this is your secondary again. You've got exactly the same setup, so he's basically just enlarging the apparatus all the time. And this is actually on the front of Peter Lindeman's book, and it shows an excellent example of the Fibonacci sequences in the in here. You can see the ratios between this part and this part, the lengths, and it's a really natural shape. It doesn't look like a normal electrical arc at all, and it's got this beautiful white colour rather than the electric blue we associate with most electric. Okay, so he concluded that the geometric configurations of the apparatus were splitting the electromagnetic components. So he was splitting the transverse from the longitudinal, basically. The electrons were trapped in the secondary. They didn't get a chance to flow because the duration of the pulse was too quick. So the transverse wave was basically not coming in before the longitudinal one has already travelled up the outside and shot out to wherever you're going to direct it at. Or if you want to create a field by having a cone or a hemisphere, you can create a field that goes out rather than a directional one. Okay. Now most of the coils that are being built these days appear to be based upon Sir Oliver Lodge's device, which is a purely AC device, doesn't use pulse DC. So a lot of the effects that we see on YouTube or wherever you want to look aren't actually pure replication of Tesla, and it appears that only a handful of people have been able to really follow Tesla's work and actually replicate it. One of them that's still contemporary with us is Eric P. Dollard, and he does some excellent stuff on YouTube through the Borderlands Institute with Peter Lindeman and Tom Brown. I recommend you look at that if you're interested in this stuff. He's broadcasting electricity, charging capacitors off of bulbs, which shouldn't happen, using single wires, doing stuff that basically shouldn't work with electrics as we're taught. Okay, so this is where we come to the little bit about the ether, because I haven't really mentioned the word ether as yet, but Tesla basically had a whole theorem on ether theory. What he was detecting was nothing like the electric that he'd come across before. He was talking about an elastic solid that was changed by these electromagnetic waves that were moving through it. And Sir Oliver Lodge, interestingly enough, even though he was trying to replicate with AC rather than pulse DC, was sure that an ether gas existed. And he actually said that it had a density comparable to steel, yet still behaved like a fluid, capable of passing through most substances and permeating substances, having no terrestrial equal, basically. And Professor Dmitry Mendeleev, who we know as the father of our modern periodic table, actually had two gases that were finer than hydrogen. And the first one of those, if I get my figures right, he said had the weight 100 millionth that of hydrogen, and it had a kinetic velocity that he calculated out at 2.5 million meters per second, which is much faster than the speed of light. Okay, but they've obviously been chopped off in modern chemistry. So where did they go? That's the question. And this is the work of Walter Russell. This is his periodic table here. It's nothing like the normal one. Basically, he looks at everything on a kind of spiral, which can also be seen as a circle, and it can also be seen as an infinity sign, depending on how people want to look at it. But the interesting thing is, everything above here, this is hydrogen, as we can see here, and all these are finer than hydrogen. Okay, all discovered by Russell, essentially. But these are ignored by modern physics, essentially. Okay. And there's a few ways of looking at the Russellian version of the periodic table here on a spiral version. And it's a shame, I've actually took the one off that is an infinity symbol which works down like that. Never mind. So after reading Jerry Facilitos' book, I eventually came upon the work of William Lynn, and with all these ether theories you like to see if anything tallies up. So looking at Lynn's stuff, he'd basically started to name these very fine particles that Tesla was finding passing through this stuff. Basically called them the Omni, and he was basically saying that they're made up in exactly the same way as we imagine an electron and a proton in a normal atom, apart from they're much smaller. He said that due to particle size, they would pass through any physical object, basically any solid. But it's debatable whether the ether is passing through the solid object or the solid object is passing through the ether. And I would say the latter is probably the truth, seeing as everything is in motion in the physical world. The Earth spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, moving around the Sun at some 60,000 miles an hour, and hurtling after the Sun at something like 700,000 miles an hour. There's no still place, essentially. But the interesting thing is, Lynn's work basically came to the conclusion that when the electromagnetic waves from infrared all the way through the visible light spectrum came into contact with this ether, it started behaving differently. Normally it sits in neutrality and we don't know it's there, but when you pulse it with an electromagnetic vibration, it becomes this solid object. You do something to the electromagnetic bonds between it and it starts to act differently. And all Faraday, Tesla, William Thomson, who's Lord Kelvin, all come to the same conclusion. Now, ether theory is prevalent pre-1930. It seems that more or less everyone from Descartes onwards had their own version of what the ether was doing, and a lot of them tally up. Experiment that was done using X-ray spectroscopy based on Lorentz version of the ether, which was an ether which was in motion. And it seems that due to the failure of that experiment, basically they threw out ether theory from 1930 onwards, once Einstein had done his theory of relativity. However, Einstein doesn't really describe what the space-time continuum is, or the fabric of space-time as he likes to call it. He likes to tell us that it bends, but he doesn't like to tell us what it's made of, essentially. So it seems like, even though the relativity guys are all talking about the fabric of space-time, they don't want to name it, and they certainly don't want to go back to ether theory for whatever reason. So interstellar space is basically said to be a vacuum, but we know it passes charges incredibly well. There's a device called a Leonard tube, which is basically an evacuated tube where they pass electrical pulses down it, and it just zips from end to end. There's no resistance because there's no larger particulates in order to bounce the electromagnetic waves off and cause all sorts of refraction and reflections. Now, these omni in interstellar space, Lynn's saying, are highly conductive, and the charges basically move freely along the magnetic lines of force. And the omni that pack space are essentially omnidirectional and sitting in neutrality at all times. So their radiation is basically of a vector of exactly the same length. And looking at the work of Nassim Haramein, he's actually looking at the cube octahedron as being the shape that the ether sits in. Because all the vectors in the cube octahedron is the only shape which has vectors of exactly the same length in 3 dimensions. Okay. Now, what Lynn's calling this, he's basically saying that the 0-point radiation is constantly twanging these clouds of electrons within atomic matter. This is why we get the blink rates where it's coming in and out, the interactions with the ether. And he is hypothesizing that this is what's creating the illusion of electron orbits, which are in fact standing waves in undulating layers of electronic clouds surrounding atoms and molecules. Okay, so this is essentially his view of things. He sees the ether as basically being static, and the atoms of physical objects as being like a flock of geese flying through the air. So there's a certain amount of resistance between the particles. Now, Lynn's looked heavily into Tesla's dynamic theory of gravity, and what he's come up with is that the interaction between the particles moving through the ether is actually causing what we call mass and gravity. And it's a well-known fact that gravity is actually 10 to the 40, that's 10 with 40 zeros, weaker than the electrodynamic force. So you don't need very much electric in order to negate gravity, essentially. And it seems that what Tesla was basically heading for throughout his life was the discovery of electropropulsion. We can kind of see that in what he was doing with Wardenclyffe and the whole rest of his experiments. I mean, the Model T Ford coil is basically a Tesla coil. It's still illegal in America, interesting enough, to use a Model T Ford coil with a spark gap for some unknown reason, because you'll discover something that's not supposed to be discovered, obviously. Okay. This is where I kind of move out of the... Are there any questions on the theoretical side of things while we're here? Has everyone kind of followed that? Does it make any sense whatsoever? Okay. So these are some of the articles that were being written in the 70s by a guy called Tom Valentine about the Ed Gray engines. They're quite incredible. No fuel electric engine can save US public $35 billion a year. No gasoline bills. Man creates an engine that consumes no fuel. Could change the course of history. Yeah. Quite incredible. Where did it go? Well, the sad thing is he actually died in his workshop age 65. A healthy man, had a heart attack essentially. Had a strange visitor that night as well. So, conspiracy theories aside, it seems another.
Has that just disappeared now? When there's no record of that?
No, these engines are still about. People are trying to replicate this in America. It's one of the devices that I've been looking at. Where is the picture? Sorry. There was a picture on there. I must have deleted it. Well, there was a picture, one of Tom Valentine's pictures actually shows himself, actually, interestingly enough, putting a light bulb which has been, which is using this current that's being made by the Ed Gray system. He's got it in a glass of water, essentially, and the thing's lit, and it's not electrocuting him. We all know what happens when you put an electric light bulb in water. It will kill you, essentially. So it's not using the same thing. It's a luminescence that's being created by this etheric effect. It's not normal electricity. So this here is the Ed Gray system. Ignore this bit. There will be a simplified. This is the one off the patent, basically, and this is an AC inlet, basically. So this all gets cut off because we've got a DC inlet. The battery is up here, and really this should be coming straight down through these two wires into the transformer, through the bridge rectifier, into the capacitors. And then what it's doing is it's coming up here into this weird looking device here. Now what this is a spark gap which has been embedded into a glass tube and then has two copper gauzes around the outside of it. The interesting thing is this is the motor up here, and the positive is not physically linked to this wire here. So whatever is driving the motor is not physically linked to the positive drive of the batteries or the transformer. Okay, so whatever's going on with this spark gap here, there's some sort of effect being captured, and that's what's driving the device. Okay. There's also another weird thing that goes on with this, which is the fact that the other side of this is also connected to the positive of the battery. Okay, whatever that does, I don't know if it builds up a pressure on the front back edge of this in order to create a high potential across the spark gap. Still not entirely sure. There's a couple of weird things about it though, obviously. I mean, you never have a break in the connection to the motor off a normal system, that's for sure. So a lot of this is based upon the work of Peter Lindemann. That's a larger picture where you can see a little bit more detail on the spark gap. And you can see this here is the copper plates. So they're actually capturing an electro-radiant event which is caused after the spark crosses the gap. So there's a couple of theories on how this happens. William Lynn actually talks about a process where anything under 20 in the periodic table has very strange properties when it goes through a spark gap. So hydrogen, for instance, and this is actually documented, you can actually weld atomically with hydrogen by making it go from H2 into H1 and back to H2 again. And this actually releases massive amounts of heat, which they were using to weld tungsten, which melts at something like 4,300 degrees centigrade, so very hot. But what isn't explained is as the gas passes through the spark gap, it has an action which blows the electrons further away, which makes it monatomic from diatomic. And then as it collapses again, it releases the spark gap actually needs 103 calories per mole to blow these electrons out and make it monatomic. But it creates 109,000 calories per mole as it collapses again. Now the explanation that Lin gives is that what happens is when you blow the electrons out, basically it has a larger orbit and therefore it's covering more ether. And as it collapses, its interaction with this larger amount of ether is actually collapsing with it and being released at the same time. Okay, hydrogen welding basically got swept under the carpet in the 30s and was replaced by TIG and MIG, which are inferior, to say the least. The other interesting thing about hydrogen welding is that if you capture the hydrogen coming out the other side, because it's the H2 again, you can have a circular system, and you don't require any fuel besides what you're using to fire the spark gaps. There's no massive amounts of gas or electric needed in these systems. Lynn's actually designed a system which he's saying can be used quite easily in a house, which is basically, I meant to put it on the PowerPoint, forgot earlier on, Essentially, it's got a chamber, which is the gas storage device, spark gap just above it, and a heat exchanger above that. And it's basically a circular system. So the H2 basically gets pulled straight back down the bottom. And has anybody come across a PAP engine? Has anybody seen those? They're plasma engines basically, because as it passes through the spark gap, you're creating a plasma out of the gas. And they're exactly the same kind of setup. Now what is happening here is you've got nitrogen and oxygen, which are both below 20 in the periodic table. And what Lynn's found is, as you pass the spark gap across hydrogen and oxygen, what is released is about 12,000 volts, which if captured will come straight down this wire and into this. So there's no way you can create that amount of energy off a 12 volt battery. You're just not going to do it, even with a best transformer. So you use this electroradiant event in order to capture this weird thing that happens with anything under 20 in the periodic table. It's the gases that you've got to concentrate on. There's lots of things that are under 20 in the periodic table which are metals or liquids, but the gases are of particular interest. So you're talking about things like neon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. Helium's is an excellent one as well. Okay, so hydrogen, I've just told you, is about 1,000 times, a coefficient of about 1,000. Helium's 4.3 times better than that, according to Lynn. Okay. The interesting thing is here that this essentially is the same type of thing as what Tesla was doing. So he's using pulse DC, he's rectifying this. This device here is splitting is creating AC from the batteries. Comes into the transformer, because you can't transform DC, you have to transform AC. Goes back through here, through the bridge rectifier, creates the DC again. Comes up, charges the capacitor, then goes through here as a unidirectional event again, and creates that effect that you're looking for. So this is replacing the primary and secondary, essentially. This is your primary, this is your secondary. Okay, and it's all contained within this. And it seems that the latter day work of Tesla's was actually using these glass vials. There's a story of him with this Pierce Arrow car, where he comes along with his nephew, and he basically has this box in the front of the car. The engine's been stripped out. He's got an electric motor in the front. He puts these 5 or 6 vacuum tubes or glass tubes, they might be filled with nitrogen and oxygen, I'm not entirely sure, into this device. He has an aerial on the top, and they just drive off in the car and do test runs, and this car was outperforming all the petrol cars of the day. 70 horsepower motor running off this. Okay. And Moray was also doing the same sort of thing. If you look into the work of Thomas Moray, he's also using these glass tubes, and he's eventually, after he's got these devices down, he's running submarines and all sorts of stuff off them. So you can basically do this anywhere on the planet. It doesn't matter where you are, underwater, in the air. You can use this type of technology. And this is just a simplified version, basically, taking out all this clutter out of the patent in order to see what's actually going on. This is what's necessary in order to build the circuit. And the paraphernalia in here mostly is unnecessary. And a lot of the time when an inventor first puts a patent out, he deliberately puts things in which are superficial and not really needed in order to kind of protect it, obviously. So this is Peter Lindeman's version, where essentially he's stripped away all the other stuff and just got the absolute essentials. So if you want to replicate this system, this is the one to go for, essentially. And you can find this, Peter Lindeman's book is called Free Energy Secrets. I recommend you read that again if you're interested in any of this stuff. It's another excellent book.
Have you heard of Professor Searle? S-E-A-R-L?
I have, yeah, I've looked into some of his work. It's not contained in this talk, unfortunately. It's also really interesting stuff. Yeah. So this is a diagram of the commutator which sits in the top of Ed Gray's engine here, and this is taking the electrodynamic pulses out of this spark gap. Essentially this motor is using 2 north-facing magnets. If anybody does any sort of magnetic healing, you'll know that the north side's the compressive side and the south side's the expansive side. So having 2 north-facing magnets creates a massive, it's a much better opposition than south-facing magnets, basically, and you get a huge push. Now, the original experiments Ed Gray was doing was to have an electromagnet that was bolted down, and then a free one that was sitting on top, and these were large devices that weighed several kilos. And what he'd do is he'd fire up the spark gap, put a pulse through it and shoot the electromagnet up in the air, just as a demonstration. Sounds highly dangerous to me, but a good bit of fun. I might try it at home at some point. So what he did basically is he harnessed this, he pushes it into the electromagnets via this commutator. It's basically a very finely made engine. These are all points on here for taking the charge. It's basically timing the device, similar to the way we do it with camshafts and that these days. This one's one of his motors. This has got 9 different magnets around the outside with 3 on this. Okay, highly efficient. Essentially in these systems he was having to get rid of the power because he had far too much, and he was running these at 70 horsepower off a couple of 12 volt batteries. So abundant energy basically. And here's the picture I was talking about. This is Tom Valentine. This is not particularly clear, but this is the water, and he's got this bulb in the water while it's being powered. So we know, I mean, this demonstration is just an excellent example of the fact that this isn't what we think of as electricity that they're using.
That's your Stubblefield time radiant, isn't it?
Yeah. So I looked into John Bedini's work as well. I kind of got sidetracked off of the water stuff actually. I was very interested in Schauberger first of all. But I got interested in the dual fief circuit, and then I got interested in the Bedini wheel because I wanted to drive the dual fief circuit. So essentially this is all about north facing magnets as well. You've got all outward facing magnets, all north facing magnets on your wheel, and you've got a north facing coil. Now the coil, this is, John Bedini had an experience where he basically went to see E.V. Gray, and he started replicating E.V. Gray's work, but then he got to visit some heavy mob essentially. He put him up against the wall and said if he carried on the work they were going to kill him. So rather than capturing the electro side of things, John Bedini basically started looking at the magnetic side of things instead, because they're intrinsically linked. So his machines are kind of the opposite side to what E.V. Gray's doing. So E.V. Gray's using an electric pulse to drive the engine, but what John Bedini's doing is using the magnets to actually drive the engine, but also capture the pulse that happens afterwards as well. So the system's set up with a transformer in it, which is switching 2 sides of the circuit. And he's got 2 separate coils in there. One of them's driving the circuit, and the other one's capturing the event that happens and charging the secondary battery. Okay. Now, these devices built like this are not over Unity devices. John Bedini will be the first to admit that. But they do show that there is another type of electricity being captured by this device. That it's not normal. You can do the same test as what you do with the E.V. Gray stuff, and it's a radiant type of electricity. It's not moving in the same way. The other thing is, there's an excellent film that Peter Lindemann and John Bedini have put together called Battery Charging Secrets, which we might show here at some point. Essentially, what they're doing is they're using a pulse to charge the battery of incredibly high potential. Now, this is a simple circuit. Excuse me. If you make this circuit so it's capturing the back end and put it back to the front end in the primary battery, you can keep this running for much longer. But in radiantly charging this battery, essentially you can make it run better than it's rated for, and also you stop it sulfating. So the main thing that we do with batteries these days is we don't charge them to a high enough voltage, number one, and we charge them, we force the voltage back in rather than pulsing it, which gives the battery time to breathe, and it stops. We don't let the chemical process that's in the battery really get to its full conclusion, which means that what happens on the plate is that you end up with lots of layers of sulfur in between the lead, and in the end the battery won't take a charge because there's not enough lead to fulfill the process of the hydrochloric acid changing back into. There's a whole. It's better to watch the Battery Secrets rather than have my explanation, because it's all about chemistry and what happens inside the battery. But what they found is most battery chargers only charge to about 14.1 volts, whereas the battery really needs about 16.1 volts in order to fulfill its process and go back to how it was in the original state without sulfating. And using a pulse charge is not forcing the battery to take on the charge, it gives it time to breathe in between the pulses. So essentially what they found is the over unity aspects of this happen in how you're charging the battery. This is what John Bedini has found, and this is an example of a 10 coil machine that he's built. There's lots of films on the internet. There's also Energy from the Vacuum, which is an excellent series. I think it's Energy from the Vacuum 2, where he's doing bench tests on this. He's spinning it out for about 10 minutes or so and charging a massive bank of batteries, more or less back to capacity. You can see it on the capacity meter that he's using, and then driving a massive bank of lights again. So the device is working incredibly quickly. I mean, it's not fully explained from how much energy you're getting out of this side and how much energy you're putting into this side, essentially. And it's not from the wheel, it's from the way the battery is being charged, which is the interesting thing, and the way the chemistry is interacting with its outside environment, essentially. Okay? Any questions on that?
Not a question, but just an observation that you can actually run that without the wheel at all.
You can use an oscillating circuit.
Well, actually, you just put a higher resistor in the beginning of that circuit, and it will self-oscillate and generate the same.
Yeah, it's another weird thing that happens.
Yeah.
However, there's another interesting thing that happens with this. If you put a fan on the other side of this, which means you're using it to do work, the ampage will actually go down that you're driving it with. I've done this myself. Also, if you put a generator coil on there, again the ampage will drop, and you can pull about 15 volts off your generator coil, and this thing will actually use less electricity out of the battery, which is just weird. I don't know quite how it's working at this point, but it's quite an amazing effect. So
you say it's not an over unity device?
not in itself, but it does. They're telling you openly that it's not an over unity device. There's a lot of bullshit on the internet, but John Bedini will tell you openly it's not an over unity device. However, it does have some interesting aspects to it, such as the ones I've just mentioned. And there's also a whole battery charging thing. You have to condition the batteries because they're not used to a pulse charge. Okay. You can get charging devices from them, but what you need to do really is you need to go through a whole process of desulfating the plates. Even when you buy a battery, the plates can be sulfated already. So what you normally do is you go through a process of charging and discharging, and each time you discharge you go a bit deeper into the discharge. So normally you're told not to just take a battery down below about 11 volts minimum, but you can take it right down to 2 if you want it, you know. They tell you not to do it, but you can do that with the battery, and you can pulse charge it. I've done it. It doesn't damage the battery. So this is another device which I'll talk about in a second. This can actually be checked with a little magnetic device, a magnet meter, which will tell you north and south on the magnet, on the device. Now this is all the north facing bits on the magnet, and these are all the bits that are actually physically present on the wheel. Okay, but when you check it with a magnet meter, there's actually a south pole in there as well, which happens between the north poles. Okay, so it's a scalar south pole. It's not actually present physically, okay, but it's an effect that happens due to the way you're using the magnets. Basically you're doing something that's not natural in nature, and so nature wants to come in and it wants to redress the balance, and so you end up with this south pole in between the north poles. And John Bedini's actually looked at where this actually fires and takes the charge, and it's all about using the expansive side, the scalar south pole. So he's driving the device with the north poles, and he's capturing what's created by the south poles, which aren't physically present. this is all about nature coming into this device from the outside, because nothing's ever isolated. Now, if this was a normal system, basically none of this South Pole would be calculated into it. They'd call it an over-unit device and basically say this can't work, and they'd never look at it. However, if you've got a slightly open mind to this stuff, what you'll do is you'll look at it again and you'll see that this is actually interacting with its outer environment, as all devices do, as Maxwell and Faraday and these other guys knew well. In Maxwell's original equations, he accounted for all the stuff that's going on within the interactions that happen in electromagnetic bodies. It was cut out later by Lorentz. Some could say it's a conspiracy theory and Lorentz was doing it on purpose. I like to believe that Lorentz was a kind of cool guy, and all he was doing was trying to create a system that he could use at that particular time in order to run an electrical circuit, which is where most of our dipole systems come from. It's all from Lorentz's work. It's just that we've kind of refused, because it worked, to go back and look at the technology again, and we've ended up 70 years later being in the same boat as we were back then, without redressing what these guys were doing before Lorentz, which is a shame, really. It seems it's all due to certain corporate interests.
Debt Free TV, in association with GetOutOfDebtFree.org.